Hey guys, I'm doing something a little different today, and this is going to be a follow-up video to a recent video I had made. This was the leather wallet project. I had done this as a request from my wife. She wanted a minimal leather wallet that she could just throw in her pocket real fast when running to the grocery store, held basically just her CCW, bank card, and ID. Now, this was the first leatherworking project I had done, well, the first stitched leatherworking project I had ever done, and really the first project I had done sort of everything on, meaning, I designed it, I, stained the leather myself, I, stitched the whole thing together, etc. So in doing all of that, I didn't really do a lot of research. I do watch some leatherworking videos from time to time, but I didn't really pay a whole lot of attention as far as the exact order of operations to do things, and I sort of just jumped into this project head first, and in doing so I made a lot of mistakes. Now in the original video, I just put up a big blurb saying, hey, I made a lot of mistakes, this isn't a tutorial. But a lot of people were interested in getting into leatherworking, and they'd ask what the mistakes were. So I thought I would kind of quickly go through the video and highlight the places where I made like a big mistake or even a little mistake, just so other people don't have to make the same mistakes. So what I'm going to do here is basically just fast forward up to each section where there's something to talk about, and I'll briefly pause and talk about what I would have done differently or why that was a mistake. Some of the times it didn't really matter all that much, and in the end the wallet did come out just fine, but I did want to highlight a handful of things here and there. So right here in the beginning is where I kind of started making errors. So as you can see from the leather edges, during the tanning process where they're stretching it all out flat, there's a lot of sort of artifacts from the clamps, and the edges are a little bit wavy, and I included that section in my pattern, thinking that since I was going to be wet forming some parts of this project anyway, I would just soak all the pieces and that would flatten them out. The problem with that, which it did work, but the problem with that is that once the pieces are cut out and then you wet form them, they move. There's a lot of movement in the material. It slightly changes shape. It becomes very pliable, surprisingly pliable actually. And any little bit of handling will stretch and move the leather around a lot. So really what I should have done is, if I was going to wet everything, I should have cut this entire section out, wet it, flattened it all out, and then cut the pieces out once it was completely dry. Alternately, I could have just cut all the pieces out of a section that didn't have any of the wave in it at all. So yeah, right here, even after having cut the pieces or marked the pieces too close to the edges, I still could have recovered from it pretty easily just by or soaking this entire piece, staking it out flat, and then letting it all dry perfectly flat and completely dry before continuing. But instead, I cut the pieces out to their final dimensions and then soaked them, and that ends up causing all the trouble. Okay, so right here I'm getting ready to wet form the front card pouch, which basically just means I'm going to be making a hard shell out of the leather by wetting it, forming it, and then letting it dry. Now, of course, I don't let it dry all the way like I should, but more importantly, I should have cut this piece out oversized, not to final dimensions, by which I mean I should have cut the piece bigger, then wet formed it, and then after I had the indentation perfectly formed and completely dried, then I should have marked off the seam allowance basically for the stitching allowance, and then trimmed it to basically whatever the card dimensions ended up being. Now again, this did end up working, but it was a lot more difficult to align, and it ended up being not quite right, and then I had to kind of trim it a little bit after the fact to get it lined up, whereas if I started with a larger piece, wet formed it, and then made my marks for the borders, it would have come out perfect on the first try. Also later in the project, it's not really highlighted because I think I may have done it off camera, but there's a little like a finger tab to be able to pull the cards out, and I add that same mark to the bottom later, so you can't see it in this video, but that little half circle at the top, I later add one of those to the bottom as well. Now in this section I'm going to be staining the leather, and that went more or less smoothly. The problem is that I never really let the leather dry all the way, and you'll find that's a consistent issue throughout this build, is that I'm working with wet leather that wants to stretch and pull and move and deform, and because the leather is wet, it doesn't absorb the stain quite as well as it could have. It ended up looking okay in the end, but it has more of a weathered, distressed look, and had I put it on dry, I think it would have been a far more consistent, even tone. So here I'm going through and punching the holes for where I'm ultimately going to sew these two panels together. Now the real problem here, apart from the fact that I'm still working with slightly damp leather, is that I'm just holding that front panel in place. And I'm just counting on the fact that it's not moving. And I did end up with a slight misalignment issue. Really what I should have done here is maybe use some barge cement to just lightly glue that in place beforehand, let it dry, and then gone through and marked or punched all my holes for the stitching. That way there would have been zero chance for misalignment. Also, if you can see in that front card pocket, there's that little half moon shape in the top that I talked about earlier. I later cut that same shape out, but I hadn't done it yet, so I ended up punching holes all the way along the bottom border of that front pocket, where really I didn't need them to go in the middle. I only needed them to the left and the right of where that little half moon cutout will ultimately be. But because I didn't know that when I did this, I marked all the way across, and I ended up having to put stitches in those sections because there was already holes there. Now it's not going to hurt anything, doesn't look bad, but there are basically just some useless stitches that go only through a single piece of leather right in the middle of the final product, which I'd rather not be there if I knew I was going to do that in the future. Now here I'm just going through and burnishing the edges of this front piece because this is the last chance I'm going to have to do that. The problem with that, really, not that there is really a problem with that, is I'm just using the handle of one of my tools, and really I could have gotten a better profile and a cleaner, slicker look on the edges of the front leather, or all of the leather in the end, had I used a real burnishing tool. Now, I could have stopped, taken 5 minutes to make a proper burnishing tool out of any number of tools in my shop. I've got loads of scrap wood that would have made a great one, and I probably will make one in the future. Or I could have just bought one for like $5. But instead of making one, I decided to use what was on the table, and I didn't get as good a result. And again, you can tell I'm having some trouble with the fact that I'm working with damp leather. As much as I can keep stressing this, don't work with damp leather. It just wants to move on you, and it's nothing but a pain in the ass. Now, of all the mistakes that I made, this is the one that hands down caused me the most grief. And really it's the culmination of a lot of mistakes that all sort of overlapped in one glorious failure. So to start with, don't use a mechanic's vise for stitching. It is a grappling hook for thread. It is a nightmare. Literally every surface on this vise is designed almost like systematically to catch thread. I mean, it is an absolute nightmare. Like as I'm talking here, just keep an eye on the thread. You're going to see it tangle and get caught on literally every surface of this thing. It is miserable. This is all made worse by the fact that, one, I'm still dealing with wet leather. So the leather wants to move around, and to combat that, I'm having to hold the leather so low in the vise, so close to the stitches, that I just don't have a lot of room to work. On top of that, because I'm dealing with wet leather and wet stained leather, which I haven't let fully dry, and because it wasn't fully dry, I haven't ever buffed it all the way out. The stain ends up kind of embedding itself in the wax that the thread is coated in, so the thread ends up taking on sort of a brown tinge by the time I'm done, which all of that was a nightmare as well. What I really should have done is taken literally 10 minutes to whip together like a really fast what's called a stitching pony. People who know what they're doing, when they're sewing leather, they use what's called a stitching pony. It's essentially a specialized vise. It's like a really tall wooden vise with soft jaws that has like a clamp or screw mechanism to hold the tooth halves together, but it keeps your work up high and, more importantly, away from anything that'll catch. Also, I used really, really long thread here, which just exacerbated the entire problem by allowing these huge loops, which just extra catch on everything. Now, that was just because I'm inexperienced and I don't know how much thread gets eaten up in the stitching process, but honestly, I knew I was using too much. Now, what's worse, really, than having made all of these mistakes is at any time here, I could have stopped. I could have let the leather dry. After having learned how much of a pain this was while sewing this front panel, onto, the front of the back panel, I could have decided that this wasn't worth it. I could have made a stitching pony. I could have, just kicked back and had a beer while everything dried out. No. Instead, I decided to carry on being my stubborn self, fighting this thing the entire way, just getting more and more annoyed. And then when it came time to sew the two back panels together, what did I do? The exact same thing. I wanted it done with. I only had one day to do this, so I decided to just fight all the way through it, and you can see just everything catching on everything. I cannot even begin to describe how much I don't recommend using a mechanic's vise or really long thread for stitching. You know, I mean, you're going to need to cut your thread longer than you need, and you're going to need to use a vise, but don't use this vise, and don't work with wet material. Never ever work with wet material. Obviously the material needs to be wet for wet forming, but let it dry completely. It's not worth the time you're going to save getting a project out quickly if the project ends up coming out crappy. So here you can see that I cut that half moon out of the bottom there, and I had to stitch all the way across that bottom border because I'd already punched the holes. And the reason it's soaking is because I'm essentially having to re-wet form this because I didn't let it dry properly in any kind of proper drying like jig to hold the shape of those cards to begin with. So the reason these are so tight right now is I have a third card crammed in there just so in the final version it'll have enough room to move. Otherwise it'd be a nightmare to get these things in and out. And here I am back struggling on the vise with even longer threads this time, like a genius. By this time, well, maybe not this time in this particular scene here, I can't tell, but I did sort of get the hang of the stitching by the end of this whole process, where it wasn't getting caught every single time, and you know, I got the right process for getting the needles through. But I mean, seriously, I just made this whole process a million times harder on myself. And of course, the leather's wet again from the wet forming, so now it's even wetter than it was previously. So that makes everything extra fun. Now, because of all the movement and alignment issues, I'm having to go in and re-clean up all of the edges and re-bevel the corners just to get everything kind of squared back up again. And then I'm going to ultimately wet form it. I think I end up soaking this entire thing in water again, and then just letting it dry for like a couple of days until it is just bone dry with the cards all in place, and ended up getting a really good fit in the end after having done that. But again, this is all headache that could have been completely skipped had I bothered to watch a few tutorials or even think about the right way and the right order to do a lot of these things. So here's the almost finished project. You can see the stain isn't quite even. The thread is filthy from all of the stain that got embedded in the wax. But I mean, it worked. The stitching's not perfect. The alignment's not perfect. But it is a completed project. It worked. It was a success. It was a lot harder than it needed to be, and it could have come out a lot better if I had just taken a few seconds really to think about the right order to do some of these steps in instead of just diving in head first. But honestly, that's kind of the way I like to learn. I'm never going to forget these lessons because I sort of learned them the hard way. I can guarantee you I'm going to be building a stitching pony before I stitch anything else. I can guarantee you that the next time I stain leather, I'm going to be doing it in a different order and not working with wet leather and things like that. I kind of like those hard lessons, which is why I often will go out of my way to not learn the right way to do something before just diving in. But it can be a little bit frustrating at times, but honestly, all in all, I had a lot of fun with this project. Like, I had a blast. Here, as you can see, I'm just going through with some saddle soap and buffing the surface with the nail brush there. That's just removing any of the excess stain that's sitting on the surface, as well as it's cleaning up the threads quite a bit. They looked a lot better after getting brushed off with the saddle soap. Now, after it had fully dried for I think 2 days with the cards in place and everything was nice and hard and wet formed and decent, I then went back after having finally learned my lesson of not dealing with wet leather and then finished burnishing down the edges to give them a nice cleaner look. Again, I probably should have used a real tool or made one or bought one, but I'm just using the handle of my tool, which actually did work fairly well. And that's it. Finished project. I mean, it could have come out a lot better. It could have come out a lot worse, though. I actually had a lot of fun doing this. The only really hard or frustrating part was the stitching, and even then, I wasn't really that upset about it, but it was definitely a trial. It was a lot of fussing around, and, I just assumed skip that part next time. So if you like this, please like and subscribe. Till next time. Talk to you later, YouTube.